Okay, welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to learn how to use all the various transform tools that Photoshop has to offer in order to transform a layer as an aid to composing things, but also as a way, there might be other reasons why we want to manipulate a particular layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and open two files. The first one is this man.jpg. I just searched for man face on Google and Creative Commons licenses, and this was the first image that showed up. So I thought this would be a good one to roll with. The other image we're going to be looking at is this architectural heritage building, which if you just search for, if you're not in the class, and you just search for, buildings in perspective, you could find any that are in perspective. And what we're going to do is we're going to be putting that face on this wall as though we're kind of mocking up a mural or something like that that would be painted on this surface. Okay, so let's go ahead and open those up. I'm going to open both files at the same time, right? You can hold down Command or Control or Shift or whatever to select multiple things. Okay, so I've got the man up first, and what I'm going to do with this is to use the object selection tool. Now, I know some of you probably don't have the object selection tool if you have an older version and it hasn't been updated in a while. If possible, I highly suggest you update to the newest version of Photoshop. If not, you could potentially use the quick selection tool to select his face, or use the lasso. I mean, really, you don't need to do a great job. You just need to do a good enough job that you have something with his head cropped out of the black background. So I'm going to use object selection because I know that it works pretty well in this use case. So I'm just going to go ahead and circle this very quickly. And this is a huge image, so it's going to take some time to think about it. Oh, it went quicker than I expected. Okay, so I've selected that, and all I'm going to do is hit Command-C and Command-V or Control-C, Control-V to paste it into a new layer so it has a transparent background. Okay, once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and just drag this layer onto the architectural building and just drop it. And then I'm going to select the Move tool. And to start with, right, as I said, this image is huge, so we need to make him smaller. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our first transforms, right? And I think I've talked about this before, but scaling, rotating, and moving the image are considered transforms as well. And those are just sort of the very basic level of transform that we can do. And so if I go ahead and I'm just going to scale this down, by default, the scale tool scales it uniformly. If I hold down Shift while I do this, it's going to scale it non-uniformly, right? So I can, squish his head or make it really fat or whatever. But as soon as I let go of Shift, if I let go of Shift before I let go of the mouse button, then it's going to snap back to scaling the normal way. Also, if I hold down Option, it will scale from the center point of the layer. Right, so you can see that now it's zooming in and zooming. It looks like it's zooming in and zooming out around the center, like kind of right between his eyes. And so sometimes, and it's just good to know that you can either be scaling from a corner, because sometimes that's the way you want to do it. Other times you know where you want your image to be and you want to scale from the center. So holding down Option allows you to do that and saves you a ton of time. So I'm going to make his head about this big. It doesn't really matter. Now, again, in order to set a transform, with these basic ones, you don't have to do this necessarily. Sometimes now if you just choose a new tool, it'll set it. But if I double click on that, it'll set that transform. And so what that means is Photoshop essentially gives you like a preview of what the scaled image will look like. And then when you double click on it, it actually applies all of that to the full resolution version and ends up looking a little bit better once it's done. Okay, so I've scaled this down some, and now we need to look at the other possible transform tools. So I'm intentionally leaving his head over here a bit just so we can talk about these tools, and then we'll move them over here in a second. So to do other types of transforms, the way you get to those options, in some programs you think, oh, maybe I can right click and do it. Like in Illustrator, if you right click, you have transform controls. You don't have that in Photoshop. So the way you transform this in Photoshop is you go up to Edit at the top of the screen, the menu at the top, and you go down to Transform. And there's Free Transform, which kind of sort of has all the tools in it, but I want to show you the individual ones first. We're also going to look at Puppet Scale, Puppet Warp. We're not going to look at Perspective Warp right now. So first there's Transform Again, so you can essentially just repeat the transform that you did, right? So if I shrunk it by, say, I shrunk it in 50% in scale or whatever, I shrunk it so it's not half as big as it was, I could make it half as big as it is currently again if I did that. That's not what I'm interested in doing right now. So we know we have scale and rotate. We're able to use those just in the base mode by hovering over the corners to scale and then going out beyond the corners a little bit to rotate. There's also skew, distort, perspective, and warp. And so we're going to start with skew. Skew is the most simple. What skew does is, right, it lets you skew the image. You can basically, I can't drag this up and down, but I can drag it left and right. And similarly, I can also click on one of these sides and, right, I can move this up and down, but I cannot move it left and right, right? So it locks in, certain points and certain abilities to move this, right? I don't want to do that. So in order to not do a transform, you either hit the escape key or you can come up here to this no symbol and just click on that and it will cancel the transform. So I'm going to hit escape. So that's skew. Sometimes that's really useful, especially if you're trying to make like text look like it's going fast or something. Oops. And so let's go ahead and go back to transform again. And let me hit no because somehow I accidentally transformed that a little bit. Okay. So there's several other options in here. So we have skew, we have distort, and we have perspective. I'm going to show you perspective first, and then we'll go to distort. So what perspective does is if I grab one of these corners, it will pull the opposite corner down. And then if I hover over the center line, right, I can move this up and down, but you'll note that it moves this in perspective, but I can't go left and right. I can't squish it down, right? I have to leave it at, whatever width I want, which, if you look at this, right, this isn't exactly, if I was to try and use perspective on this, it's not really working the way I want it to. This wall isn't quite perfect. You can see things are not perfectly up and down. And so this isn't the best way to use this. However, it can be really useful in a lot of cases. But right now, not exactly what we want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. So now I want to show you distort. And distort is the one that we are going to use to make our transform. So, but we'll look at warp as well. And we'll look at some of these other options down here too. So let's go ahead and look at distort real quick. So before I do this transform, I'm actually going to say no, because what I want to do is I want to copy this layer and I want to paste it. And that's so that we have one that's actually on the wall like we like it. And then we're going to have another copy that we're going to mess with a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on layer 1 and I'm just going to go to duplicate layer. And sure, I'll call it layer 1 copy. And then I'm going to take layer 1 copy, and this will be the one that I'm actually going to apply to the wall over here. So distort, so let's go ahead and go to edit and go down to transform and then distort. Distort lets us grab each one of these corners and move them completely independent of the other corners. And so this means I can essentially like scale this and make it change. So what I'm going to start is I'm going to take this corner and make sure they're on this wall. And then I'm going to come down here, and what I want to do is I want this top edge, right, to be more or less parallel to this edge here, right, because then it'll be in the correct perspective in that way. And I'm going to go down here and basically do the same thing down here. Right. Now, his head looks really, really wide, right? I've basically done the same thing that the perspective tool did at this point. And you can kind of see it looks like he's tipping forward a little bit, which means I probably need to bring this back up just a touch. But the other thing I can do is I can, with Distort, I can also pull this in. And so I'm pulling this in so he fits on that wall a little bit better. And then I'm just going to go ahead and adjust this top edge and, try and get it so that his head looks, somewhat like it's actually in scale. Now, there's other tools that will work for this as well, but we're not going to deal with that yet. Okay, so I do want him to be a little bit more confined to this wall, and you can see that, right, maybe I actually do need to pull this down a touch. Okay, so I've got him more or less set in the perspective that I would like, and I'm just going to put him right there. Now, some of this too, right, with cameras like this shot's pretty wide, and you may notice that this wall kind of bows up here. And that's because the camera that was used to do this was a wide angle lens, which means that the glass, there's more distortion on the edges of the image, right? And so even just using Distort isn't going to quite be enough. We could actually go in and use the next tool, which we're going to look at over here, to give it a little bit of bow as well, so that it even matches this more closely than it already does. But as it stands, I'm happy with his face at this point, so I'm going to double click that to set that. And you'll see that cleaned up that transform a fair amount. Okay, so I have made him so he fits better on that wall. So let's go ahead and look at this image. So I'm going to grab layer 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to go to edit, and I want to show you what warp does, and then, let's do flip horizontal and flip vertical. So flip horizontal and flip vertical, basically just, right, flip the image. So if I click flip horizontal, right, you'll see now the lit part of his face is on the opposite side. This is really useful for things like this, like say, oh, the sun is actually coming from this angle, so his face looked kind of weird with the shadow on the other side. But if I flip it this way, then he looks like he's being lit by the same sun that's in the scene, more or less, right? It's not perfect, and he's a floating severed head in space, which doesn't really help the situation either. But, right, that might be one reason. Maybe you have an image of someone pointing in a certain, left, and you want them to point right. That would be a use. Or maybe you have someone standing up and you want them standing on your head, so you do flip vertical. All right, I'm going to undo that because, those last two things, because I don't really need to have it flipped, but I want you to know how to do that. It's really, really useful. These rotates, they just, the rotate commands here just are like a one-click thing, so you don't have to drag the thing around 90 degrees or 180 degrees. You can just rotate it instantly, either 180 or 90 degrees in either direction. So let's look at warp. So I've got the warp tool here, and at first it looks pretty similar. Nothing has changed. But what warp does that's different than the other tools is it allows me to grab onto these little handles and actually bend the material. Now, you might already see how the top of this looks like maybe like if there was a book that was here and it was open, right? This kind of looks like it might be the open page of a book. This is one of the use cases that is frequently used, is to make an image appear as though it is on the page of a book. Right? That's really simple. Also, say if you were making labels for wine bottles or some other round cylindrical thing, this tool, right, if you, depending on the perspective of your, or where your camera is located in reference to the bottle, right, you can do this to make it look like the image wraps around something. I'm going to undo those last few steps real quick. You can also move the corners, right? So I can bend the corner down, and I want you to note that when I do that, really strange things can start happening, right? Because really what we're doing is you can imagine this as like a stretchy piece of material that we're able to like even fold over on itself. So yeah, so you can move the corners, you can move the different handles, so you can really distort these images. I'm going to undo that. pretty dramatically with the warp tool. It's a pretty fluid way to work. And this can also help with, some pretty subtle changes. Now, there's a couple other features you can do with the warp tool. So if I go up to Edit and I go back down to Transform, you'll see that now I have, these things were grayed out before. I can have this split warp horizontally, split warp vertically, or split warp crosswise. If I say split warp horizontally, what it does is it gives me this edge that I can do a split on. So I'm just going to go right across his eyes for now. And when I do that, now I have two new points to this warp, right? So I can actually have more control points to deform the image. All right, so at first I just had those four corners, but now I have something inside, and I can make, ridiculous things happen. I'm going to pull this over, pull that in. And so if I come down to these corners over here, right, I could pull his jaw out, right? Now it almost looks like a caricature or something of this person. So, all right, so I can add a horizontal split. I'm going to undo all of this to bring his face back. If I go back up there, I can come down to Transform again, and I can do a vertical split as well. So I could come in the middle of his face, or I could do this in thirds or whatever. And then again, I have the ability to, I now just have that many more control points, and note that, right, it actually pulls his whole face around now in the center as well. So this warp tool gives you a ton of different settings. Now, one of the issues is if you warp this and you do a transform and you're not happy with it, right? Right? It basically is set in the way that it was that you last worked, right? So if I had warped this and then I finished the transform, it's stuck that way, right? This layer is stuck this way. I can't go back and undo the warping that I did to it. Now, if, however, I turn this into a smart object, if I right click on the layer and go to convert to smart object, then if I go up to my transform controls and go down to, let's say, warp, and start to warp this, let's just go ahead and I'm not going to do anything too fancy with this. I'm just going to warp his face a bit. And if I check mark this, it does not. So if I do this warp, you'll note I still can't fix it. However, this is a smart object, right? So the base object is unwarped, but I have warped its reference here. So I can always right click on this and make some adjustments to it. And so I want to show you how you do those adjustments. So if I right click on this, once I've done the transforms, note that I have this option to reset transform now, right? So that allows me to, and you'll see edit contents here, that just opens up the file and I can make something there. But the big thing is here that is this reset transform. So if I click on this, it'll reset it and do everything else that I didn't do before, right? That's something that is really nice about using a smart object for this, is you can at least get back to your base state. Okay, so the other thing, the last tool that I really want to show you in this tutorial is Puppet Warp. And Puppet Warp works similar to Warp, but it's much more, you have a lot more control. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Puppet Warp. Okay, so I've selected Puppet Warp, and I have Show Mesh checked, which should be on by default for you, and it should look like this now. And what this does is, you can imagine it's taken your layer and it's turning it into a sheet of rubber that you can pin to a wall in different places. So you can set a pin, and then if you want to, if you just have one pin, you can kind of rotate around that and stretch from that. And if you set a second pin, then you can pin that stretch, and you can continue to do that in all sorts of ways. So let's start by, let's just drop a pin right between his eyes. All you do is you just click once, and it'll drop a pin. Okay, so I've set one pin. Now it's time to set a second pin. So I'm going to click here on his chin, and now if I click and drag this pin, right, I can rotate around the first pin. And the other thing I can do is you can tell that I can squish and stretch this around this. Now note that where it's squishing and stretching from isn't exactly where I put the pin, but it's that vertice, it's that point where those lines meet closest to the pin, right? So it's not directly on there, but it's close. And so this is a really nice tool because it allows you a great deal of control. So if I was to say, let's go ahead and drop another couple pins by his ears. And now if I pull this in, you'll see that as I get more pins, more of the mesh stays stable. And whereas you can see where if I don't have pins set, I get a lot more motion across the surface, like up on the top of his head. As I add more pins, like these two here near his ears, I have more control points, but you'll notice that wherever there's a pin, a lot less motion occurs compared to where no pin exists on the mesh. So before we do anything else, I'm going to uncheck Show Mesh, just because it makes it easier to see what's happening here. And then let's say that we want his, whoa, my mouse just decided to fly off the screen. So let's go ahead and let's say we want him not to have quite such a broad jawline. Let's make it a little narrower. So I'm going to go ahead and add a couple more pins here. And I'm just going to start to snug this up a little bit. Right, so I can make, and in this case I probably made a little bit too strong of a motion, but that's all right. Right, but so I can start to make subtle changes by adding additional pins to this person's facial features, right? You could also make subtle changes to someone's body. This is a way that when you see those like pre and post Photoshop images of models or celebrities or whatever, this is one of the key tools that they use to slim bodies and change or increase bust size or whatever it is that they're doing. Right, this is one of the main tools that people use to do that because you can, if you make big changes, people are going to notice, right? So that's comically bad. But if you make subtle changes with this, you can fool people. Like no one will notice that it's been manipulated unless they're shown the original image, right? So again, if you want to say have his hair expand but keep his forehead somewhat in the same place, we can drop some more pins around his hairline, and then maybe we just do a couple pins up here, right? And so we can actually, have his hair go, in like a Wolverine style. I can drop this down in the center a little bit. Although you can see that when I do that, that's probably too hard of a corner, so I actually need to pull a couple points down to make this a little bit better. Right, but so there's a lot of things that you can do to manipulate this with the puppet warp, right? And there's a lot more that you can do with this. If you have a figure with where the arms are out to the side or something like that, or you have arms and legs, you can actually go in and manipulate those. There's a way, if you hold down Option, if I hold down Option, I don't click on it, you'll see I can actually rotate and twist around this point. And you may wonder why you would want to do that on an image like this, and you really probably wouldn't want to do it on his head. But if you have that set at a joint, like say his elbow or his shoulder or his wrist, then you'd be able to rotate the arm, right? Or bend the knee or something like that. So it gives you a lot of freedom to manipulate and pose static images that were not posed in the way they were posed before. So once I've done that, if I go ahead and hit the check mark up here, because I'm happy with this, right, it's going to set that transform. Now, what's nice about Puppet Warp is that it acts as a smart filter. And we haven't really talked about this too much previously. We talked, I think I touched on it a little bit with smart objects. But now if I go ahead and I can actually turn off the puppet warp, right? So it's back to its normal state. I can also double click on puppet warp and I can get back in there and I can be like, oh, actually, you know, this point should should go really crazy, or maybe actually I don't want this side of his head to be warped up. I just want this side to be warped, right? And so then I go ahead and I can hit the check mark again and it'll update, and now it's warped that way. So that's one of the nice things about puppet warp, is that when you use it with a smart object, when you've turned your layer into a smart object, you can continue to manipulate it. If you don't do that, whatever pins you've set, and then if you set that transform, then it's permanent unless you go back several steps and undo it. Okay, and this is the whole tutorial. Oh, this is not the whole tutorial. I wanted to show you how to make this face look more like it's actually on the wall, right? Currently, it kind of looks like it's there, but it doesn't really blend that well with the wall. And so there's a couple things that we can do to make a quick and easy adjustment. And so I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit, just so we can see this change happen a little bit faster. So I've got layer 1 copy selected, and the first thing I'm going to do is I could just go ahead and reduce my opacity some. Right? And so that allows some of the texture to show through on the wall, but it just really makes this thing look washed out, which isn't what we want. So I'm going to go back to 100% opacity. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to try some of these other options. Now, darken or even darker color is nice because you can see the bare wall everywhere the wall. Let me just go ahead and select darker color so I can use my mouse to point. Right, so this is the texture of the wall, right? So it really makes it feel more like it's on this surface and as though it's using the wall color as white or as the brightest color in the palette. Now, something else that would help is if this wasn't hanging out down there, which is something we could clean up later. So that's one thing that really helps make this feel like it's in place where it's supposed to go. You could test other options as well. Multiply might work too. You get that texture through there, but it's full color and the color intensity is nice and strong. Darken and darker color are really similar. It's hard to tell the difference. Color burn, I mean, it really depends on what you're going for, but all of these others, lighten, isn't really going to work very well. Screen, if you were doing a black and white image that was going to be on there, that might be a good option. Right, and so if I go through these other options, none of them are really going to stand out and really show the texture of the wall quite as well as those first two options I showed. But you can just go through and, test all of these if you'd like. Luminosity is a really nice option too in this case. And so I'm going to say, let's do multiply, and then we could attempt to reduce the opacity a touch. Like just a little bit, so I've got it at 85%, because then it feels a little, right? The color, if the color is too intense, it's going to stand out because there aren't, super intense, super saturated colors in the rest of this image. The other thing that's making this not look like it's there, although now you can see the shadow is actually being cast on the image. We need to get rid of that little blob there. But the other thing is that we need to blur this a little bit. You'll notice that the camera, if I zoom in on, say, these trees or any of these details here, right, you'll see that it's a little bit out of focus, whereas this is perfectly in focus. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is go up to Filter. And I could convert this for smart filters at this point, which would allow me to test my filter a couple times. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to convert for smart filters. And what that means is it makes it a smart object, right? So now I can go back up to my filter and I can just go to blur. And I'm just going to use Gaussian blur. It's the best just general blur option. And I'm going to go ahead and, it's giving me a preview that I can't actually see, so I'm going to zoom out until I can find, there we go, his head, and then I might go ahead and zoom back in a little bit. All right, so it's at 0.3 pixels, which isn't much, but it does soften that up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and put it at 1.3 pixels. Now you can see that it's blurring over here as well, right? And so what I'm trying to do is kind of mimic the amount of blur that I see on this sign and on this wall with the head there. And so I'm going to say, okay, maybe just 1 pixel is enough. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. Right, and so now with that blur on, if I turn the blur off real quick, you can see a little bit of a difference there, right? But it just feels, with that little touch of blur on there, it feels like it's more like it's supposed to be there. And maybe it needs even a bit more. And there's some other more advanced blur filters we'll look at later that would allow me to have more blur, say, and I'm sure things get blurrier over here. So I could have less blur here and more blur as I go across the image there, which would again make it feel more like it's actually in place. Okay, let's do the last thing that we need to do to clean this up and make it look good. So this is a sign that's on the wall behind it. So you may have some idea from the previous tutorial what we're going to do. So I'm going to turn the visibility of layer 1 off. I'm going to select the background, and I am just going to use the lasso tool. I'm going to circle around this thing. I'm going to hit the delete key on the keyboard, and I'm going to say content aware and hit OK. Right, and so then I'm going to deselect that. That's disappeared. Now I can turn this back on, and that little sign is no longer in the way. Now, again, this might still be, the colors seem like they're still a little too strong, so I might want to reduce the opacity. Oh, apparently the opacity is at 100% now, and that's because when it made it a smart object, it reduced that opacity, or it brought that opacity back up to 100%. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to maybe 90%. That looks a little bit more washed out. Something else we could always do is you could always add an adjustment layer to adjust the color and things like that to make it look better. But there we go, right? So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and you can see that, right, this looks a lot more like it belongs in the scene than this head does right now. But this is a way to use these tools to add things into your scene that don't already exist. All right, thank you very much for listening.